I was reviewing an old shareholder agreement. I had no particular reason to double-check that afternoon. An old habit from the considerable care I'd taken reading every document before investing my entire retirement savings into my son's first startup nearly 9 years earlier, when an unrelated financial planning inquiry from my own accountant asking me to confirm the current value of my equity holdings for an annual review sent me digging through corporate filings I hadn't examined closely in years. What I found there, a public filing showing my own ownership percentage at just under 2%, rather than the 15% I had originally negotiated and genuinely believed, I still held rearranged the entire shape of that afternoon. I had no idea that my son Rendon had been quietly diluting my ownership stake through a series of additional stock issuances over the years. Each one technically legal on its own, but never once properly disclosed to me as a shareholder with genuine voting rights, and that within the following month, I would consult a corporate attorney, formally demand a complete accounting of every dilutive event since my original investment, and pursue legal action to recover the actual value my genuine 15% stake should have retained. My name is Camille Ravensworth. I'm 63 years old. I spent over 30 years working as a pediatric nurse before my own retirement. The kind of career that teaches you genuine, careful attention to detail matters enormously. But nothing in that career ever prepared me for exactly how easily a corporate ownership stake can be quietly eroded through mechanisms most people, myself included at the time, never fully understand well enough to actually monitor independently. My husband Duncan died 5 years ago, a sudden heart attack while working in his own woodworking shop on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. The kind of routine, focused task that gave no warning at all. I remember finding him there among the very tools he'd used faithfully for decades. Grief that arrives in the middle of an ordinary afternoon teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the smell of fresh-cut wood can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn slowly to keep walking past that same workshop anyway, because the alternative is letting an entire shared life go untended. After Duncan died, my own attention to the company's finer details naturally softened further still. A grief-shaped gap Rendon would eventually, if unintentionally, benefit from. I remember Rendon at perhaps 12 years old, spending an entire summer teaching himself to code from library books because our own modest household budget couldn't afford the programming camp his own school had recommended for genuinely gifted students. Duncan and I sat with him some evenings, neither of us understanding a word of what he was actually building, but genuinely proud watching our son's own focused determination, the same determination that would eventually convince us, without much hesitation, to hand over a significant portion of our own retirement savings, nearly 2 decades later. I think about that particular summer often now, understanding exactly how genuine that early promise actually was, regardless of what it would eventually also come to permit. When Rendon approached Duncan and me nearly 9 years ago, genuinely excited about a technology startup he'd spent over a year developing, he explained that he needed considerable seed funding to actually launch the company properly, and that he'd already secured commitments from several smaller investors, but still needed additional capital to reach his own funding target. I want to be honest about why we said yes so readily, because I think that honesty matters considerably more than a version of this story where I simply appear naive about basic investment protection. Rendon had always been genuinely brilliant, the kind of son whose own early talent for technology had impressed his teachers throughout his entire childhood, and watching him pursue something this ambitious felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of investment in his own future that any parent would genuinely want to make. Duncan and I invested a considerable portion of our own retirement savings, $150,000, in exchange for a formal 15% equity stake in the company, along with an actual seat on the board of directors, terms Rendon himself proposed and that our own attorney at the time confirmed were genuinely fair, given the scale of our investment relative to the company's initial valuation. I remember signing those documents at our own kitchen table, Rendon genuinely emotional about the trust we were extending him, promising more than once that he'd never once let that trust go unhonored. I believed him completely in that moment, and I think looking back, that belief was never actually the mistake, only the absence of anything checking whether it remained warranted over the years that followed. For the first several years after that initial investment, everything felt like exactly what we'd hoped it would be. Rendon sent regular updates about the company's own progress, invited us to occasional board meetings where we genuinely participated in meaningful discussions about the business's own direction, and the company itself appeared to be growing steadily, exactly the kind of gradual, promising trajectory any new investor might reasonably hope to see. I remember one particular board meeting, perhaps 3 years into our investment, when Rendon presented the company's first genuinely profitable quarter. Duncan and I, sitting at that conference table, feeling something close to parental pride, considerably beyond what most investors probably experience watching their own portfolio companies succeed. We drove home that evening, already discussing what our own eventual dividend income might allow us to do with the remaining years of our retirement together. Looking back now, I can trace considerably more warning signs than either Duncan or I let ourselves actually notice clearly over the following years, largely because our own genuine unfamiliarity with corporate finance left us without the actual tools to recognize what a considerably more honest reading of the company's own filings might have revealed. Board meeting invitations had grown noticeably less frequent by our 4th or 5th year as investors, Rendon explaining each time that the company had simply reached a stage where day-to-day operational decisions no longer required full board input as often as they once had. We trusted those explanations precisely because we trusted him. An equation I understand now was never actually as sound as it felt at the time. There were smaller signs, too, ones I only recognize clearly now. Rendon had mentioned on several occasions during those middle years some version of the company needing additional funding rounds to support genuinely ambitious growth plans, framing each mention as simply routine business news rather than anything that might actually affect our own existing ownership stake specifically. My daughter Nessa mentioned once during a family dinner years ago that she'd read an article about how startup equity could sometimes be quietly diluted through repeated funding rounds if existing shareholders weren't genuinely careful about participating in each one, a comment I remember acknowledging at the time without ever connecting it directly to our own specific situation. I think about that particular dismissal often now, understanding exactly how much clearer my own daughter's unclouded observation actually was than my own, considerably more complicated, maternal loyalty. The first genuinely concrete incident happened about 4 years before I actually discovered the discrepancy, when Duncan, still alive at the time, mentioned that he'd tried calling Rendon directly to ask about our own dividend expectations, given the company's own apparently growing revenue, receiving only a vague explanation about the company reinvesting everything into growth rather than distributing profits yet. An explanation that satisfied us both at the time without prompting either of us to independently verify our own actual ownership percentage. I remember Duncan mentioning it to me almost in passing that same evening, both of us moving on to other topics within minutes, never once imagining that phone call represented anything beyond ordinary business caution. The second incident happened when I noticed, reviewing an old annual report Rendon had sent us years earlier for an entirely unrelated reason, that the specific language around shareholder voting rights seemed considerably more complex than I remembered from our own original agreement, a detail I attributed at the time to simply the natural evolution of corporate documentation as companies grow larger and more established. The third incident happened during an ordinary phone call, when Rendon mentioned, almost too casually, that the company had recently closed a genuinely significant new funding round, framing the news itself as simply exciting business progress, rather than anything requiring my own direct participation or consent as an existing shareholder. The fourth incident, the one I think about most now, happened at a family dinner about a year before I actually discovered the discrepancy, when Rendon mentioned in passing while discussing an unrelated topic that he'd recently brought on a considerable new venture capital partner, someone whose own reputation in the industry apparently required certain governance changes to the company's own board structure. I remember nodding along at the time, genuinely unaware that this particular conversation likely represented one of the exact moments my own board seat and voting influence had been formally, if quietly, diminished. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid seeing what was actually happening. Rendon is just genuinely busy, running a growing company, and some reduced communication with early investors is simply an inevitable part of that growth. He's always been brilliant with the technical and business side of things in ways Duncan and I never fully understood ourselves. And we should trust his judgment on the specifics rather than second-guessing someone with actual professional expertise in exactly this area. Our relationship as his parents doesn't simply crumble without some considerably more obvious sign than a few less frequent updates and some funding rounds we never fully understood the mechanics of. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than confronting what a considerably more honest reading of the evidence had already been quietly suggesting for years. There was one particular afternoon, about 18 months before I actually discovered the discrepancy, when I came close to requesting a complete, independent review of my own actual ownership percentage from a corporate attorney, rather than continuing to rely entirely on Rendon's own periodic updates. I mentioned this intention to Nessa during a phone call, and she encouraged me to actually follow through with it, gently pointing out that it had been years since either of us had genuinely verified what my own stake actually looked like on paper. I remember agreeing with her in the moment, and then, in the ordinary business of daily life following Duncan's death, simply never quite getting around to it, telling myself that whatever changes had occurred likely remained as fair and reasonable as everything Rendon had ever described to us. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that timing. The moment to insist on that independent verification had arrived considerably earlier than I let myself believe. I simply wasn't ready to confront whatever that verification might actually have revealed about a son I had trusted so completely with our own family's genuine financial security. Then came that accountant's own routine inquiry. I sat with that public filing for a long time before doing anything at all, understanding with a clarity that genuinely stunned me exactly what its numbers might actually mean. I pulled every corporate filing I could access directly myself for the first time in years, working through unfamiliar legal documents with growing genuine dread, tracing the actual history of every stock issuance the company had made since my own original investment. I spent that entire weekend at my own kitchen table, the same table where I'd once signed those original investment documents with such genuine pride, working through spreadsheet after spreadsheet, cross-referencing every filing date against the sparse, informal updates Rendon had actually sent me over the years. Nessa came by that Saturday afternoon, finding me still in my own bathrobe, surrounded by printed documents, and I remember her face shifting from concern to genuine alarm as I explained in halting, disbelieving sentences exactly what I was starting to piece together. She sat with me for the rest of that afternoon, helping cross-reference dates against her own memory of family conversations over the years. Both of us slowly assembling a picture considerably more damning than either of us had initially expected. What I found there was considerably worse than I had initially let myself imagine. Across 5 separate funding rounds over the previous 6 years, the company had issued substantial additional shares to new investors, each round technically diluting existing shareholders' percentage ownership, unless those shareholders exercise specific rights to participate proportionally, rights that, according to my own original shareholder agreement, I had genuinely possessed the entire time. Rights I was never once properly notified I could actually exercise. I did not confront Rendon that same day. I want to be honest about that choice because I think it matters. I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me, given the personal relationship involved, that confronting him immediately, armed with nothing but my own private discovery, would simply give him an opportunity to explain, minimize, or offer some version of events that might not actually reflect what a genuinely complete investigation would eventually prove. I called my old friend Sibley first, a woman I'd known for years through our own local community group, someone who had heard me talk about Rendon's company more times than either of us could probably count, without ever imagining it represented anything concerning. I sat in my own car in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes before actually dialing her number, still trying to organize my own thoughts into something coherent enough to explain out loud. I told her the whole story, the filing, the actual dilution I'd already traced myself, my own genuine shock at what a single afternoon had already revealed. She listened without interrupting, her own voice tight with something between fury and heartbreak on my behalf. "Camille," she finally said, "you and Duncan put your entire retirement into that company. And now your own son has quietly reduced your stake to almost nothing, without ever properly telling you. I don't think there's a single version of this where you owe him patience before you fully understand exactly how far this actually goes. I keep waiting to feel like I'm overreacting, jumping to conclusions before I've actually heard his side," I told her, "and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Sibley said, "because you're not overreacting. Your actual ownership percentage dropped from 15% to under 2% through funding rounds you were never properly given the chance to participate in, despite having contractual rights to do exactly that. That's not a misunderstanding waiting for an innocent explanation. That's exactly the alarm it looks like." I contacted a corporate law attorney directly the following week, a sharp woman named Halfreda Blaylock, who specialized in exactly this kind of shareholder rights dispute, recommended to me by another investor I'd met years earlier at one of Rendon's own early company events. I explained the situation plainly, the filing, the pattern I'd already traced myself, my own need for a complete independent understanding of my own actual legal standing before I did anything else at all. "Camille," she told me, after reviewing the initial documents I sent her, "if your original shareholder agreement genuinely included preemptive rights, meaning your contractual right to participate proportionally in future funding rounds to maintain your own percentage ownership, and you were never properly notified of those rounds in a way that allowed you to actually exercise those rights. This represents a genuine breach of your shareholder agreement, potentially compounded by breach of fiduciary duty given Rendon's own position as both an officer of the company and your own son acting with your genuine trust. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do next, because I think it matters. I did not confront Rendon before I had a complete picture. I did not simply demand an informal explanation and accept whatever partial accounting he might offer without genuine, independent documentation behind it. I authorized Alfreda to formally request the company's complete corporate records, every board resolution, every notice of funding round, every document related to shareholder rights and participation opportunities. Since my own original investment, wanting genuine, thorough verification of exactly what had happened before deciding how to proceed. Nessa called me 2 days after I finally told her what I'd found, her voice tight with genuine shock rather than her usual composed calm. "Mom, are you certain, completely certain, before you do anything else?" "I'm certain about what the public filing already shows," I told her. "I'm still waiting on the complete corporate records, but I'm certain enough about the pattern I've already traced myself that I've already retained an attorney to pursue this properly." "I don't know how to process this yet," she admitted quietly. "I keep thinking about him presenting that first pitch deck to you and Dad at our own kitchen table, so genuinely excited, and I can't quite reconcile that memory with someone who'd actually do this to his own mother over nearly a decade." "I understand that difficulty completely," I told her. "I'm living inside that exact same difficulty myself right now. But whatever complicated feelings we're both working through don't actually change what I'm actually owed, or what my own financial security genuinely requires me to pursue." The complete corporate records arrived nearly 6 weeks later, considerably more damning than even my own initial discovery had suggested. Not only had I never received proper notice of my own preemptive rights during any of the 5 diluted funding rounds, but the actual board meeting minutes from several of those periods showed my own name listed as present and voting, meetings I had genuinely never attended, votes I had genuinely never cast, apparently recorded by Rendon himself or someone acting under his own direction. Alfreda's own investigation took nearly a month to complete, working with a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate governance disputes to trace every single stock issuance, board resolution, and shareholder notice since my original investment. I remember the specific phone call when Alfreda asked me to come in personally rather than simply emailing the findings, understanding, even before she said another word, that whatever she'd discovered was considerably worse than what I'd already pieced together myself. I drove to her office that same afternoon, my own hands unsteady on the wheel the entire way there. "Camille," Alfreda told me directly, "this level of documented, deliberate misrepresentation isn't simply a failure to notify anymore. Someone falsified corporate records to make it appear you'd participated in and consented to decisions you were never actually informed about. A pattern that suggests genuine, deliberate concealment rather than simple administrative oversight." I sat with that revelation for a long time, understanding exactly what it actually meant. I wasn't simply a mother discovering that her own son's company had grown in ways that happened to reduce her original investment's relative value. I was the victim of deliberate, sustained corporate fraud, executed by someone who understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how much genuine trust I had extended him with our own family's actual financial security. That particular combination, genuine maternal love paired with genuine financial vulnerability is exactly what made this kind of sustained exploitation possible in the first place. Halfrida's office occupied a modern suite downtown, considerably more polished than I'd expected. Shelves lined with corporate law volumes alongside framed tombstones from various past deal closings. She listened to my entire account without interrupting once, taking careful notes, occasionally asking precise questions about specific board meeting dates and the exact language of my own original shareholder agreement, before finally setting down her pen and looking at me directly with genuine, evident concern. I met with Halfrida to discuss exactly how to proceed. Camille, she told me, reviewing everything we'd compiled together. You have genuinely significant options here. And I want you to understand you don't have to choose the gentlest one out of some misplaced sense of maternal obligation, especially given what this documentation actually reveals about deliberate falsification rather than simple oversight. You can pursue formal legal action to recover the actual value your genuine 15% stake should have retained, accounting for the company's own current valuation. Given the falsified records specifically, you may also have grounds for additional damages beyond simple restoration of your own ownership percentage. I want to be honest about the choice I actually made because I think it matters considerably more than the emotional betrayal alone. I decided deliberately and without any real hesitation once I understood my own actual legal standing clearly, to pursue full legal recovery of what my genuine ownership stake should actually be worth. I was not interested in quietly accepting a reduced stake simply because the person who'd engineered that reduction happened to be my own son rather than a stranger. Whatever remained of our personal relationship, I understood would have to be figured out entirely separately from that financial decision, on a timeline that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings themselves. I confronted Randon on a Sunday afternoon at his own company's offices, with Halfrida's complete findings already prepared and waiting in a folder on the conference table between us. Randon, I said, my voice considerably calmer than I actually felt in that moment. I know about the dilution. I know I was never properly notified of my own preemptive rights during 5 separate funding rounds. And I know board minutes exist showing me present and voting at meetings I never actually attended. His face went genuinely, completely pale. Mom, I can explain, he started, and I watched him search, visibly, for whatever version of an explanation might actually make any of this sound smaller than it genuinely was. I don't think you actually can, I told him, not in any way that changes what the documentation already completely proves. I've already retained an attorney to recover what my actual stake should be worth, and I need you to understand that I'm pursuing every legal option available, including addressing the falsified records directly. You're going to destroy the entire company over this, he said, his voice rising with something between disbelief and genuine panic. This was never actually about the company, Randon, I told him. It's about years of you letting me believe I still had a genuine voice in something I helped build, while you quietly took that voice away through falsified paperwork. That's not a disagreement about business strategy. That's fraud, dressed up as your mother simply not needing to understand the details. I'm not destroying anything, Randon, I told him. You did that yourself. The first time you decided your own mother's genuine ownership rights mattered less than keeping the company's own cap table simpler for new investors. I'm simply the one finally naming it directly. Instead of letting you keep taking from me for however many more years, you were apparently planning on continuing it. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across the table between us, I told myself I'd make it up to you eventually. Once the company was genuinely successful enough that a smaller percentage of something bigger would still be worth more than a larger percentage of something smaller, he finally said. His voice considerably smaller than I'd ever heard it. I never meant for you to actually find out this way. I kept telling myself there'd be a better time to explain it, and that time just never actually came. I sat with that admission for a moment, understanding, even in the middle of everything, that it likely contained some genuine twisted belief beneath the pattern of deception itself. I believe you probably told yourself that, at least at first. I told him honestly. But rationalizing it doesn't undo years of actively hiding it, Rendon. Through falsified board minutes and quiet dilution you engineered, specifically because you understood exactly what you were taking from someone who trusted you completely. Those aren't the actions of someone who simply made an isolated business decision. Those are the actions of someone who understood precisely what he was doing and worked deliberately for years to make certain I wouldn't discover it until it was genuinely too late to do anything but accept whatever remained. I don't know how to fix this, he said. You don't fix something like this quietly, I told him. You account for it, completely and honestly, which is exactly what Halfreda is already making certain happens, regardless of what either of us actually wants at this particular moment. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own hands. Does Nessa know everything yet? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She will very soon, I told him. I'm not going to hide this from your sister to protect you from her own reaction. She deserves to understand exactly what happened, and however she chooses to respond to that is entirely her own decision to make, not mine to manage on your behalf. Do you think Dad would have handled this differently? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. Would he have actually gone through with the lawsuit? I felt something tighten in my own chest at that question, understanding, even in the middle of my own genuine anger, exactly what he was actually asking underneath it. Your father spent his entire life believing that honest work deserved honest treatment, I told him. I don't think he would have handled this any differently than I actually am. I think he'd be genuinely heartbroken, exactly the way I am, and I think he'd still insist on exactly this, because loving you and holding you accountable were never actually opposites to him, any more than they are to me right now. He built entire pieces of furniture over again from scratch, rather than let a single flawed joint go unaddressed, and I don't believe he'd have treated this any differently. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think the harder, more honest version matters considerably more than a softened one. Rendon did not become genuinely remorseful in any way that changed my own decision. He spent the following weeks alternating between minimizing what he'd done, framing it as standard startup dilution that any investor should genuinely expect, and growing increasingly resentful about the legal consequences themselves, arguing at one point that pursuing formal litigation would destroy the company he'd spent nearly a decade building, as though that risk somehow outweighed what he'd actually done to create it. That particular argument, more than almost anything else he said during those difficult weeks, revealed exactly how completely he'd failed to understand what he'd actually done. Halfreda addressed it directly during a mediation session I'd insisted on before proceeding to full litigation, explaining with genuine patience that standard dilution, the kind any sophisticated investor genuinely expects and can choose to participate in proportionally, bears no resemblance to what Rendon had actually done, deliberately withholding notice of that exact opportunity while falsifying records to suggest his own mother had knowingly consented to decisions she'd never once been informed about. Rendon sat silently through most of that particular session, and I remember watching something shift slightly in his own expression as Halfrida spoke. A flicker of genuine understanding breaking through what had otherwise remained defensive resentment throughout those difficult weeks. His own attorney tried at one point to interject with a softer characterization of what had happened, and Rendon, surprising both of us, quietly asked him to stop, saying only that he needed to actually hear this rather than have it managed for him any further. There was one particular family dinner, about 6 weeks into the mediation process, that I still think about often. Nissa had invited me over, hoping, I think, to create some small sense of normalcy amid everything else. And the entire evening carried a strained, careful quality. Neither of us fully knew how to navigate, given how completely our own family dynamic had shifted. She asked, at one point, whether I thought she should still invite Rondon to her own upcoming birthday celebration, and I told her honestly that the decision was entirely hers to make, that I had no intention of asking her to distance herself from her own brother simply because I was pursuing legal action against him. She ultimately did invite him, and I chose to attend anyway, understanding that avoiding my own daughter's birthday would punish her far more than it would ever punish Rondon. The following months were genuinely difficult ones, in ways I want to be honest about, rather than minimize for the sake of a tidier story. Nessa struggled visibly with her own relationship to her brother during this period, torn between genuine anger at what he'd done to their own mother and a sister's own complicated, lingering love for someone she'd grown up considering her closest sibling. I never once asked Nessa to choose a side in the way people sometimes imagine families being forced to during a dispute like this. I told her plainly, more than once, that her own relationship with Rendon was entirely hers to define, on her own timeline, regardless of whatever legal action I had already decided to pursue. I called Sibley often during those months, needing more than almost anything else a voice that had watched Rendon grow up and could speak honestly about exactly what had actually been lost. Camille, she told me once over coffee at the same small cafe we'd been meeting at for years, I keep thinking about how much genuine trust you and Duncan extended him, precisely because he was your son, rather than some stranger asking for investment capital. I don't think you're wrong to refuse to let that trust keep costing you. Just because protecting yourself means admitting how badly it was actually broken. The mediation sessions themselves took nearly 3 months to fully resolve. Rendon's own attorney initially arguing that restoring my full 15% stake at the company's current, considerably higher valuation would be genuinely disproportionate, given the actual capital I'd originally invested. A position Halfrida dismantled methodically by pointing out that the entire reason my stake had failed to appreciate proportionally with the company's own growth was precisely the falsified dilution itself, and that restoring the actual percentage I was contractually owed was the only remedy that genuinely corrected the harm rather than simply compensating me for a fraction of it. I remember one particular session where Rendon, prompted by his own attorney's genuine concern about the mounting legal costs and reputational risk of continued resistance, finally acknowledged, out loud and on the record, the full scope of what he'd actually done, describing in considerable detail exactly how the falsification had started as a single, desperate decision during one difficult funding round, and had simply continued because stopping would have required admitting the very first instance to me directly. Given the complete documented scope of what Halfrida's investigation had actually revealed, we ultimately secured a settlement restoring my own ownership stake to its genuine 15% equivalent value, based on the company's own current valuation, along with a formal written acknowledgement of exactly what had occurred. rather than proceeding through the considerable additional time and expense of a full civil trial that risked genuinely damaging the company Rendon had built. I think about that particular afternoon often, the exact weight of that public filing on my own screen, understanding with total clarity exactly how much had already been lost long before that accountant's own routine inquiry finally revealed it. At the time, it felt like the beginning of losing whatever remained of my own relationship with my son. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of finally completely protecting what remained of my own financial security, without ever again having to quietly wonder what else might be happening behind numbers I'd trusted someone else to report to me honestly. I don't regret investing in Rendon's company 9 years ago. Genuine belief in someone I loved and trusted completely mattered to me then, and it still does now. What I don't accept, and never will again, is the idea that discovering a betrayal, this significance somehow obligates the person who discovers it to respond gently, patiently, or with any real concern for softening the consequences on the person who actually caused them, simply because that person happens to be your own child rather than a stranger. I think sometimes about how easily that particular expectation gets placed specifically on mothers. The quiet assumption that we're somehow better suited to absorbing our own children's mistakes gracefully rather than actually naming them directly. And I no longer accept that expectation as something I owe anyone, regardless of how close the relationship happens to be. I think, too, about all those years Duncan and I spent explaining away small, uncomfortable observations rather than trusting our own genuinely careful instincts that had served us faithfully throughout decades of otherwise careful financial planning. I no longer believe that kind of patient doubt is actually a virtue when it comes to something this significant. It's simply a slower, quieter way of protecting someone else's comfort at your own genuine expense. And I paid for that particular habit considerably longer and considerably more expensively than either of us should have ever needed to. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The board meetings that grew less frequent without any real explanation. Duncan's own vague answer about reinvested profits rather than dividends. Nessa's own quiet, easily dismissed observation about how startup equity could be diluted if shareholders weren't genuinely careful. Each one, individually, felt small enough to excuse, especially given how completely we trusted our own son's genuine business judgment. Strung together, they formed a pattern I no longer believe was ever actually ambiguous, one I chose not to examine too closely, because examining it honestly would have required confronting something about my own beloved son I genuinely didn't want to be true. I've wondered, too, whether Rendon genuinely understood in real time exactly how much he was actually exploiting our own genuine lack of corporate finance literacy, rather than simply making an isolated poor decision under investor pressure. I don't think that distinction matters as much, practically speaking, as it might seem to. Whether he consciously calculated that his own parents' confusion around dilution mechanics created a genuine ongoing opportunity, or whether he simply drifted funding round by funding round into a pattern that only later revealed its own full shape. The actual harm to my own financial security remained precisely the same either way. Intent shapes how I understand his own character. It doesn't change what he actually took, or for how long, or why our own genuine trust mattered as much as it apparently did to making that pattern possible at all. Real protection of something this significant, I've come to believe, depends entirely on treating your own careful instincts with the same seriousness you'd want anyone else to treat them with, refusing to let genuine love for a child excuse away a pattern that, examined honestly, was never actually ambiguous at all. If a family member needs you to treat your own considered financial oversight as somehow optional, simply because family shouldn't require that kind of ongoing verification, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves an immediate direct response, not a patient wait-and-see approach extended indefinitely simply because addressing it feels like a genuine betrayal of the trust you've built together over an entire lifetime. I think, looking back, that discomfort itself was never actually a reason to look away. It was simply the exact signal my own instincts had been offering me for years, long before I finally had the actual evidence to justify acting on it. I think sometimes about all those years I spent believing that a good son simply managed his own mother's investment honestly, because that's what good sons did, without ever needing that trust periodically, deliberately verified against actual, independent corporate records. I no longer believe that. It took me 63 years and one very ordinary accountant's inquiry to understand with complete clarity that genuine maternal love was never actually meant to require abandoning the basic financial literacy and independent verification that protects any investor, parent or otherwise, from exactly this kind of quiet, sustained exploitation. That distinction, once I fully understood it, changed not just how I think about my own remaining investments, but how I think about every single relationship where I extend significant trust going forward. I've spoken with several other parents since all of this happened, acquaintances at various points who mentioned, once they heard even a partial version of my own story, that they too had invested significant retirement savings into an adult child's business venture, sometimes with even less formal protection than Duncan and I had originally secured. There's a particular quiet pattern I've noticed in nearly every version of that story. The same reluctance to formalize genuine, ongoing verification of an investment in a child's own company the way you'd naturally require it of a stranger's business. The same assumption that requesting regular, independent access to corporate records would somehow signal a lack of trust rather than simple, reasonable financial diligence. I understand that reluctance completely because I lived inside it myself for nearly a decade, but I no longer believe it's actually protective of anything, for either party, family included. It simply delays whatever reckoning eventually comes, and that delay tends to make the reckoning itself considerably more expensive financially and emotionally than it ever needed to be. Every single person I've shared this particular lesson with has thanked me for it, several mentioning they'd already scheduled exactly the kind of independent corporate review I wished I'd insisted on nearly a decade earlier myself. If I could offer one piece of genuine advice to any parent considering investing significant savings into an adult child's business venture, it would be this. Maintaining your own independent, direct access to corporate records and formal legal counsel isn't actually a betrayal of that trust. It's simply the same basic diligence any responsible investor would maintain, applied consistently, regardless of how much genuine love accompanies the arrangement. A child who genuinely has nothing to hide will never resent that kind of verification. It's only ever resented by someone who might eventually need the absence of it to keep something concealed. Every single person I've shared this particular lesson with has thanked me for it, several mentioning they'd already begun requesting exactly the kind of independent board observer rights I wished I'd insisted on nearly a decade earlier myself. I attend board meetings again now, considerably more engaged and considerably more informed than I ever was during those earlier years, asking detailed questions about every single agenda item rather than simply nodding along with whatever Rendon presented. The other board members, particularly the newer investors who joined during those disputed funding rounds, seemed genuinely surprised by my own transformation from what I suspect had been, in their own minds, a largely passive founding investor into someone who actually reads every document line by line before signing anything at all. I've come to genuinely enjoy that particular reputation, understanding it as one of the more unexpected, hard-won gifts this entire ordeal actually left me with. Rendon has been slowly rebuilding trust with Nessa over these past several months, though our own relationship remains genuinely strained in ways I don't yet know how to fully resolve. My own restored ownership stake now generates the kind of genuine dividend income Duncan and I always hoped that original investment might eventually provide. A small, complicated comfort, given everything it took to actually secure it. Rendon came to see me alone, unannounced, about a year after the initial confrontation, standing on my own front porch, looking considerably thinner and more tired than I remembered him looking even during the worst of the mediation sessions. "Mom," he said, "I know I don't get to just show up and expect things to feel normal. I just wanted you to see in person that I've actually restructured the entire board's governance policies, brought in independent oversight for exactly this kind of shareholder communication, not just to protect myself legally, but because I finally understand why it should have existed from the very beginning." I invited him in, and we sat together at that same kitchen table for nearly 2 hours, talking honestly, for the first time since everything happened, about the specific fear that had driven him toward that first falsified resolution, about a particular kind of shame he admitted he'd been running from for considerably longer than the funding round itself covered. I don't know if I've fully forgiven him, not in the complete way people sometimes mean that word, but I believe watching him that afternoon that he was finally telling me the truth, an entirely different thing than the version of trust I'd extended him so freely 9 years earlier, and one I intend to verify considerably more carefully going forward, regardless of how much I genuinely want to believe it. We hugged briefly at the door before he left, both of us understanding that hug carried a considerably different weight than any we'd shared before that afternoon. I called Sibley again this past spring, nearly 2 years after everything finally settled, updating her on how my own restored stake was actually performing, and how Nessa and Rendon's own relationship seemed to be slowly healing despite everything. "Camille," she told me, "I think about how much you actually had to relearn about trust in the middle of all that, at a stage in your life when most people assume those particular lessons are long since finished." I told her I hadn't expected to be learning something quite that fundamental about my own son, that the actual process had felt considerably more disorienting than I ever would have predicted. "But you got there," she said. "That's what actually matters in the end." I think finally about what Duncan would actually make of everything that happened, a question I've turned over in my mind more times than I can genuinely count since that conference room confrontation with our own son. I don't believe he'd want me to have simply forgiven Rendon quietly and moved forward as though nothing significant had actually occurred, not because he wouldn't have loved him exactly as much as he always did, but because I remember, clearly, his own particular insistence, working in that woodworking shop every single weekend of our married life. That genuine craftsmanship meant standing behind your own work honestly, admitting when something had gone wrong rather than quietly papering over it and hoping nobody noticed. I think, if anything, he would have been considerably more disappointed watching me simply let this go than he ever would have been in the eventual necessary reckoning itself. He spent his own entire life believing that love and honesty were never actually meant to compete with each other. I've come to understand something else, too, in the 2 years since everything settled. Something about the particular danger of conflating maternal love with an absence of accountability. I don't think loving someone, even a son whose entire childhood you watched unfold with genuine pride, actually requires extending them a form of trust that asks nothing of them in return regarding something as significant as your own financial security. Real love, I've come to believe, looks considerably more like what Duncan actually modeled throughout his own life. Genuine pride in someone's potential, paired with genuine honesty about their own responsibilities. Precisely because love was never actually meant to require abandoning fairness for the people who share it. I carry that particular understanding into every relationship now, extended freely, but never entirely unverified. I am 63 years old, a retired pediatric nurse whose own genuine investment finally reflects exactly what she was actually promised. A mother who still loves her son despite everything, even while understanding that love could never actually excuse what genuine fairness required of me. I am no longer a woman who quietly explains away a pattern her own careful instincts have already clearly identified. Regardless of how much she genuinely loves the person that pattern involves. That particular version of me stayed behind at an ordinary desk, along with a single accountant's routine inquiry that nobody in this family will ever quite forget having to fully account for. I sat with that filing that afternoon as one woman, and I stood up from that desk as another, entirely different one, and I have never once wished myself back into the first. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently, if given the chance to go back to the day Rendon first proposed that initial investment, knowing everything I know now. I tell them the truth. I would still invest in his genuine vision exactly the same way, because his own early brilliance was real, and believing in his potential was never actually the mistake. The mistake was extending that investment without ever building in the kind of independent verification I would have insisted upon for literally any other business relationship. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the investment I made 9 years ago. It would be the years of small, uncomfortable observations Duncan and I let pass without insisting on the same complete, independent corporate records I now understand every investor genuinely needs, mother of the founder or not. That single change would have cost us almost nothing at the time, and it would have saved me considerably more than money in the end. Rendon reached out to me directly about 10 months after the settlement, sending a lengthy, handwritten letter rather than calling, something I appreciated given how much easier writing sometimes makes genuine honesty than an actual conversation. He wrote about the specific pressure that had driven him toward that first falsified board resolution, a genuinely difficult funding round where his own investors had pushed hard for governance changes. He feared, at the time, would fall apart entirely if his own mother's formal board seat and voting rights complicated the negotiations. I told myself it was a one-time thing, just to get through that specific round, he wrote. I never planned for it to become a pattern I couldn't figure out how to stop without admitting everything at once. I don't expect you to forgive this quickly, or maybe ever fully, he wrote. I just wanted you to understand it wasn't really about you at all, even though it should have been the last thing I ever did to the person who believed in me before anyone else did. I wrote back, eventually a considerably shorter letter, telling him honestly that I appreciated his willingness to finally explain the actual pressures involved, and that I hoped He found healthier ways to handle business pressure going forward, ways that didn't involve exploiting anyone else's trust, family or otherwise. I kept a copy of both letters in the same folder as Halfreda's original findings, a small, complete record of exactly how this particular chapter of our family's history actually unfolded, start to finish. I still visit Duncan's own woodworking shop occasionally, largely untouched since his death, and I find myself, more often now, thinking about the particular kind of integrity he brought to every single piece he ever built there, understanding, with a clarity I didn't fully have before, exactly how much that same integrity should have extended into how I approached my own investment in our son's company. I don't think he ever once cut a corner in that shop, regardless of how much faster or easier it might have been. I regret now that I extended Rendon's own business the kind of trust I never once extended an unfinished piece of furniture, assuming without ever quite verifying that the underlying structure was actually as sound as it appeared. That particular lesson, learned considerably later than it should have been, has genuinely changed how I approach every significant decision I make now. These days, when anyone asks about the investment that nearly cost me my entire retirement security, I tell them the truth, unhurried and complete. 9 years of genuine belief extended to a beloved son, a betrayal that took nearly a decade to fully surface, and a mother who finally completely stopped waiting for a gentler version of an answer she'd already quietly known for considerably longer than she wanted to admit. I'm simply, finally, exactly as certain of what I'm actually owed, and exactly as certain of what genuine love is never actually meant to excuse, as I always should have been.